So now I'm pleased to introduce John Evans. John is the Managing Director of Tractus Asia. They're a leading Asia advisory firm that provide both public and private sector trade and investment assistance to companies. John frequently writes articles and is an expert speaker on trends in Asia. He's written articles for the Wall Street Journal, the South China Post, Site Selection Magazine, and many other periodicals. I could go on for a long time, but I will end it with saying that John's firm has been the representative for Iowa for the last 4 years in key Asian markets, and he serves the state of Iowa and the companies in 6 markets in Asia. So John, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your insights on this very important topic. So the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you to IEDA, Peggy, Joe, Brad, Lee, Andrea, and Lisa, who I believe are all on the call today. It has been a pleasure to work with you guys over the past 4 years, and in a very exciting and uncertain time in Asia. And what I'm hoping today is that I'll be able to take a little bit of my 30 years experience helping companies to assess markets, target customers, and then develop strategies to enter the markets and use some of that practical advice to assist all of you. To start out with sort of the obstacles, the negative side, the global uncertainty, and how there are risks to doing business abroad. And, however, these risks also bring opportunities. I just wanted to highlight some things that, maybe you don't think about as an exporter sometimes, or where markets may be. So, even the Russian-Ukraine war, which is ongoing, now that the battle has moved to the front in the south, there's a trade show that's going to be held in Warsaw, where a number of American companies are headed in the next couple of months to talk about rebuilding the Ukraine and the demand for, whether it's equipment or engineering services or technologies. And so I think that's very positive. Another one here that gets a very negative slant is the U.S. China political and trade tensions. Well, with that comes a reshuffling and moving of companies that are in China. Some of them are staying there, others are looking at expanding. And if you're selling to those companies as they're in a market like China and they're moving to ASEAN or India or elsewhere, you have an opportunity to sell to them also. And then the political risks, I just wanted to highlight quickly. The political risks mean that there are then political reactions. And currently, the U.S. government has something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is really to balance the Chinese Belt and Road expansion. And so this framework is focused on East Asia, Southeast Asia, the ASEAN region, and India. And with that are going to be initiatives to help further cross-border trade and investment between those regions, which creates opportunities. If we could go to the next slide, Joe. So, Asia may not be your most important market. That's most likely the United States and the rest of North America. And that's understandable. But for any company in the US that wants to look at growth or feels that they can't grow in the US more and they're getting inquiries from Asia, it's good to be cognizant of the fact that Asia is going to drive a lot of the growth that we're going to see in the next few decades. The International Monetary Fund, in fact, predicted that 70% of economic global growth in this year would come from the countries in Asia. Now, I think that number is probably a little bit high as China has slowed down a little bit in its economic development, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. So let's move on to the next slide, Joe. So just trends. If you look at economic growth and you think about what is a healthy economy, in the US, we're happy if we have 2.5% growth. That's robust. Across Asia, over the past 2 decades, it's averaged more than 5%. It's just slightly below that now after the COVID interruption. But we're looking at 4.5%, 5% economic growth in these very large markets. Inflation over the past couple of years has shot up dramatically. Costs have increased, but that has also cooled, and inflation is going down. And so the trends for selling into Asia are really increasing. I think the most important one is the increased consumption that we're seeing from consumers. And that is, the world's become a global marketplace, and the consumer in Asia are buying from around the world. Let's go to the next slide. So opportunities for Iowa. So I know the companies on here are not necessarily selling agricultural commodities, selling meat products, but many of the companies that are on this call are selling complementary goods, products, technologies, equipment to these sectors. And these are growth sectors. If you think about some of the countries, the developed economies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they all rely on imports of food and are going to continue to do that. Commodities, agricultural commodities are going to continue to be strong exports out of Iowa to the region, with the exception of India, which has a lot of restrictions and grows some of its own. But India, strong demand from Iowa for ethanol that goes into gasoline and many other products. And base chemicals, whether they're going into pharma or agrochemicals, there's a demand across the region. And I'm going to talk specifically to some of the countries. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a breakdown of Iowa's exports. And this little pie chart I think is really important, because I think oftentimes you don't, as a exporter, you don't understand that there's a really nice balance from Iowa. Yes, there's the two big markets of Japan and Korea in terms of exports. But if you look, Iowa's and IEDA has done a very good job of positioning the state across the Asian region. Okay, and so looking at the future, we see that the Asian demand has gone up significantly, and as we talked about on the previous slide, is going to continue to do so. The Iowa exports have declined a little bit in the last year, but that was mainly because of some agricultural commodity prices. There was the bird flu in the U.S. that hurt the poultry and egg export, and then there was some competition in Japan for meat from Europe. The heavy machinery area, particularly things like John Deere selling equipment, that slowed down a little bit during COVID, but is rebounding. So despite the little bit of a slowdown in the Iowa exports across the region, there's tremendous growth that can be had all across the region. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide, because I think what is happening from a consumer perspective, right? I'm going away from sort of the B2B buyers now and the large purchasers, but thinking about how consumers in Asia are buying products. And it's very similar to the US, and maybe I would venture to say ahead of the US. Social media drives decisions. It drives a marketplace. The convenience of the delivery during COVID, is similar to the US and is continued. There's more product comparison going on due to the ability to do so online. There is a growing trend and the ability to spend by these consumers who have more disposable income on healthier products for food or for exercise. And then there's an awareness of sustainability, which there hasn't been. So one of the things that really needs to be looked at closely is, how do you, as an exporter, target and sell into these countries, not only through the traditional methods and the distribution channels, but make sure that your product's available online, whether that's a direct sale or through those distribution channels that you have set up. Let's go to the next slide, Joe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the markets in Asia specifically. So China has been a very large export destination for Iowa and Iowa companies. It will continue to be, despite the political and economic tensions that we've seen. It will continue to be a market. It is the world's second largest economy. It has purchases from around the globe. And even though it's slowing now, which was bound to happen, it's had 30 years of growth, it still is growing. They're addressing their structural issues, not, looking at how and what the aging population needs, what needs to be done in terms of new infrastructure, both soft and hard, restructuring the financial markets. China's able to do this, and so as a market, it's going to continue. And there's no bigger, I talked on the previous slide about e-commerce, there's no bigger e-commerce market in the world. And one of the things that exporters can really think about is, I may be a little bit risk averse for the China market, but there's very little risk in selling online into the market. So let's go into the next slide. So East Asia. This is an important slide because of the issues that there have been politically and economically in the past few years. In COVID, the Japanese, Koreans, and Taiwan, the established markets, have really looked at sourcing, selling, investing with their best business partner, and that business partner is the United States. And so these are markets that we're exploring. Developing Asia, China, ASEAN, and India are still doing that, but are coming back and looking at how do we strengthen our ties to the US. And so I think from that perspective, there's a lot of opportunity in these developed markets for Iowa companies. Now, they're developed markets, they're competitive. Exporters need to figure out if their product fits a niche that's needed. They need to look at, can they be competitive in these particular markets that are developed and have a number of suppliers? They also have, if you think about the size, particularly of Japan and Korea, can you supply the potential demand that's there if you're a smaller company? And so we're seeing that these are going to be markets that are a good focus, and IEDA has shifted some of its focus to looking at how to export into these particular markets. ASEAN. So I think that the most important thing to think about for ASEAN is, what is it? It's 10 diverse nations in Southeast Asia. And as a total market, it offers a huge amount of potential. Individual markets are very different. From the diversity from cultural development status, if you think about it, you have two of the lesser developed nations in the world in Myanmar and Laos, to what is arguably and stated by the World Bank as the most developed economy in the world, which is now Singapore. So when you look at ASEAN and you look at the potential to go into ASEAN, you need to understand each country and what you're looking at, because each of them have a different regulatory environment. Each of them have demands for different products and goods. And I could go through a list of all 10 and which areas I think offer the most opportunities, but it's probably better to do that in consultation with IEDA on an individual basis. Now, Iowa's exports dipped in the last year. Some of that was just commodity prices. But you're going to see more growth from this region than other regions. And so there's an opportunity for Iowa exports to bound back up. Can we go to the next slide? One of the most interesting markets is India. India has often not been thought of as a market. Companies that have tried to export into India have found it daunting. There are regulatory hurdles. There are high taxes on many of the goods that come into the country, and it's been a difficult place to work. And while there's been a lot of interest from Indian companies to purchase, it isn't until the last few years, and really now as it rebounds coming out of COVID, that India is seen as a global marketplace. And so it's a country that I think most exporters should be evaluating. Are there opportunities in India for us? The current government has been in for 2 terms. They have done more in terms of regulatory rebalancing and looking at changing policies to make India a more open economy than in its 40 plus previous years in other administrations. So India itself sees itself as not the next China, but a similar destination for investment in manufacturing, investments in that can drive products and goods, not only for export, but going to the domestic market. And we're already seeing that. And so if I'm an exporter and I'm looking at the market, while India is not a big buyer of food yet, as it produces a lot of its own on the ag side, it does have needs for equipment, technologies as it modernizes its agricultural sector. The direct investment into manufacturing in India is increasing rapidly. And so anyone who's selling into the sectors that, support that will have opportunities. And those may be your customers that you sell to in the US. They may be the customers that have invested elsewhere in the region and now they're considering India. So it's an easy way to follow them. And then on the infrastructure side, road building. India has a huge need for road building. It's very defragmented and decentralized. They've done a great job so far of rebuilding some of their airports, some of their infrastructure, but it has a long way to go to meet the supply chain needs that the economy will need as it grows so quickly. So this is an area I think that is worth looking at in terms of your products, services, and technologies going forward. Let's go to the next slide, Joe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign direct investment into Iowa, and immediately as exporters, you think, well, why is that important? Well, it's important because it's the other side of the coin, and IEDA has done a good job as an economic development organization of having both trade and FDI in the same office. And so, what do I mean by it's the other side of the coin? Well, if a company is making an investment, it needs to have providers of construction materials if they're building a factory, engineering services, equipment. And so as we have Asian companies investing into Iowa, there are opportunities for you to sell to them, as well as then to sell to them where they are globally. So they're investing in the US may mean that you've created a customer that you can sell to around the globe. So let's go to the next slide. So I talked earlier about the developed economies refocusing their trade and investment ties with the US. That's clearly happening. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they're all looking at the US as a market to invest in. And so it's these companies that are also going to be opportunities to sell to them. Let's go on to the next slide, Joe. This is just a little sample on the agri-food side of investments that companies from ASEAN and India have made. So I talked earlier on the trade side about the number of opportunities that you're going to see in India and also from ASEAN, from some of its countries. Here's some of the companies that have invested. So I'll just give an example. In ASEAN, there's 14 companies in the ag sector that are more than $1 billion. Those companies are going global. They're acquiring companies. They're setting up facilities. Perfect targets. And if you look here, CPF, they're one of the largest. You would look at them and say they're sort of the Cargill or ConAgra of Southeast Asia. Well, they did this acquisition in Minnesota. Iowa companies, I'm sure, are already selling to them. They're a very sophisticated customer. They have a company. They could be a customer around the globe. I think they're in 40 different locations. So that's a perfect example of, as an exporter, how do I target a company from Asia that's come into the US, it's nearby. We can look at selling to them and selling the goods and products across the region. So when you're looking at companies that are coming in, there are opportunities to go out and promote your trade. So, Joe, with that, I think I'm on the last slide if you want to go one more. And this just talks about the services, and that's what you can talk about. And if the companies need something, they can look to IEDA.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, John. That is a lot of interesting information. I think for me, anyone who's in business, you just can't ignore what's happening in Asia and the potential opportunity. We definitely want to open this up to questions from the attendees. I encourage you to type those questions into the chat box, and we'll filter through those. We had a couple advanced questions on our end just to try to get things kicked off. So, John, so I apologize for difficult questions, but a lot of our exporters are small, mid-sized businesses. They look at Asia with close to 20 countries and giant economies and probably 100 different languages and 100 different religions and 100 different cultural types. How do you decide? How do you start winnowing down where you start? So the questions I get from companies oftentimes that are newer say, well, you know, India and China, that's a billion person. Why not start with the biggest first? What methodology should an exporter use as they look at new countries and how they get to those?
Great question. It doesn't have one single answer. I'm wondering how interactive we can be in this. One of the things that's always good to understand is the Iowa companies that are on today. I've seen the list. I know some of you export already. You know, how many of you are exporting? But one of the things that's important, and this is often how an Asian export develops, is you'll get a request. And you'll get a request from a company in you know, a country, and they're looking for a product or your technology. They're looking for something that you can supply to them, and it's a good indicator of demand, especially if you get several of them. And they're oftentimes distributors or agents. One of the big mistakes, and I'll start to answer the question, one of the big mistakes that companies make is that they get a single inquiry and they get very excited, and then they jump on it. And they move very quickly forward without really having run a process. And so my answer to the question, and when they do that, that ends up being a little bit fraught with risk, because it might not be the right opportunity. Might not be the right partner, whether it's an agent or distributor. You don't understand the regulatory environment, the tax environment to getting your product in. You know, and so sometimes they run too quickly. So my answer is you need to run a process, and that process starts as an Iowa company with IEDA and Joe contacting you and your colleagues. And so the first thing to help understand is this inquiry in a country or a place where there is significant opportunity, and IEDA can help you do that through a market assessment, and looking at that particular opportunity. Then, you know, oftentimes, like I said, you'll run forward with one distributor or agent. Well, maybe there is demand in that country, but that's not the right group. Maybe they sell a competitive product already. So spending the time to understand who you're talking to, doing a little bit of reference checking on them is something that IEDA can also help you with. And then stepping back and saying, you know, if I was going to go into the market, and let's say I'll take this away from Asia for a minute. And so I'm a native of Minnesota. I'm a neighbor. And my advice would be, don't do anything with anyone in Asia that you wouldn't already do with someone from Minnesota, a company from Minnesota. And so make sure that you've run that process and that you really are confident that this is an opportunity, that you understand how to do it, and that most importantly, you're comfortable with the people that you're going to be working with for that inquiry. And so it's a long answer, but it's running a process, and that the diversity, if you don't look at each of those opportunities, whether it's an inquiry or whether it's you as a company saying, look, I just heard John talk about road building in India. How do we assess that? Or there's some of the countries in ASEAN are really developing their agro economies, and they're really investing in taking up to the next levels of technology. How do we assess that? Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, Joe.
No, that was good. So it leads me to kind of a follow-up question. So in talking to a lot of companies, definitely in the infrastructure area, because of how media reports infrastructure investment in Asia, that people in that sector, get totally excited. Same with the ag sector. They see kind of indications of market potential. But as far as kind of introspection of a company, how does a company manager, executive assess their capabilities and match that with the market opportunity? So one of the common conversations that I have with companies, they're like, okay, Asia's giant, we got to figure it out. And then they, almost, not always, but oftentimes they'll default and they say, well, okay, Australia, maybe New Zealand. They speak English. And then I'm thinking, okay, yeah, definitely Australia and New Zealand are great markets. But in perspective, they're 30 million people, and you have other markets in Southeast Asia or in East Asia that are 100 million or more. And how do you decide the skills of the company? Can they succeed? And kind of, we know that the India and China markets and Japan market to a certain extent are very difficult, that you got to be a really good exporter to succeed there, but others are easier. What's the checklist that an exporter would do to say, okay, here's skills needed to succeed in the market, and how to match with their capabilities with what the market opportunity is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think I sort of alluded to it when I was talking about East Asia and Japan and Korea and Taiwan. The sophisticated markets, mature markets, lots of competition there. And particularly with Japan and Korea, there could be a very large demand in terms of buying. So, that's a good example of evaluating, if I have a company from Japan reaching out to me, could I actually meet their needs? So do I have the capacity, the production capabilities? But along the lines of your questioning, do I have the human resources in place? Do I have someone in my export office that is going to, that has experience exporting, that we've done this before, and then looking at, I'm going to use a Japan example. Japan is, for such a developed economy, it's very, it doesn't have a lot of English skills. And so how do you navigate that market with those language requirements? And that can be true in a lot of the places. So I think looking, internally looking at an opportunity, you need to think realistically of, if I'm going to need to put senior management time in, I'm going to need to put someone from my export office in on this. My business development person is going to spend time working with, the distributor or the customer. You need to actually sit down and evaluate, is the opportunity big enough for us? And is it something that we can take the time away from our normal business? And, I think that's something, Joe, you and your office can help with, because sometimes I think that new or smaller exporters don't realize the amount of time that it can go into developing that first sale, right? And so then it goes back to the other part of your question of, which markets do you target? And I think, working with IEDA, you can come up with, here's a more developed market, and I'm going to use Thailand as an example here. and I'm going to use it on two sides. I'm going to use it on the agricultural side. It's a very sophisticated supplier. It's a regional leader in terms of food production. It's also on the infrastructure side. In the last probably 5 to 6 years, it's invested more in its road network than almost anything else. So here's an opportunity. If you look at the agricultural supply, it's sophisticated, it has good buyers. Is my product or what I'm serving meeting a niche? And I will be dealing with people who know how to do this on the other side. It's maybe not as much time to do that because it's a more developed market. Same thing on the infrastructure side. They're building these roads. Has technology changed? Are they using more equipment? Is it the same as it's been in the past where it was done manually? And for example, in Thailand, they are using equipment. Where you could juxtapose that with the neighboring Cambodia, where most of the road building, which has been going at a rampant pace, has been done by the Chinese companies and labor coming in from China. So there's not an opportunity, right? So I think figuring out, where and how to target those opportunities in which market. Singapore is also an interesting market. The Singaporeans will argue that they're the network and the hub for the region, and in many cases that can be true. So and they can make it easy. So if you have a product or a technology that is in demand in the region, and you go to a distributor in Singapore, well, what you want to do is you want to vet that the distributor actually has that network in the region. And it might be a very easy way to deal with a very sophisticated buyer. Now, that always leaves a little margin on the table because there's oftentimes a second group in country that needs to make a little money on that, but it can be an easy way to enter the market. So those are some answers to that. I hope that addressed it.
Yeah. I've definitely seen in Singapore a very sophisticated market, a much smaller population, but some companies, the vetting process has been so much in Singapore that once they entered the Singapore market, kind of some of the surrounding larger markets said, well, if your product standard is high enough to succeed in Singapore, then we want you in our neighboring market. So I'm wondering, John, I know on these we try not to have it just be an advertisement for IEDA services, because there are a lot of things that a company can do on their own and alternatives, but maybe just talk a little bit about the market research as a tool and what that looks like. We don't want to break any confidence with companies that have used that, but how does a company use the IEDA market research as a tool to either identify or enter a market?
Sure. So, looking for a set of markets, looking at sort of an opportunities assessment, as an exporter, you're looking at it and you can look at the economics and say, oh, it looks like there's a lot of growth in this sector. What's happening? What a market assessment will do for you is it allows us to talk to the players in your particular sector or segment and look at, okay, we're talking to potentially buyers. We're talking to people in the trade association. We might be talking to a professor at a university. We'll also be getting an understanding just of who the competitors are, who the distributors are. And what that does is it gives you a nice overview at a sufficient level of detail to determine is there a market for you. And I can give you an example of some work we recently did in animal rendering in Southeast Asia. A company was coming into the market and they had a lot of demand. And we suggested to them that you really need to look at this. It sounds great, but if you do an opportunities assessment, type review of it, you're going to determine where the actual segments are of need. And the preconceived notion of what was needed was wrong because of the use of the animal parts was so much more extensive than what the company thought it would be, that they needed to look at a very specific small segment in which there was a very good niche opportunity. And so I think when you look at a market opportunity assessment, what it does is it gives you the direction of how you should focus in a particular market.
Awesome. So are there any questions from the attendees, issues that you would like specifically addressed by John? If those questions are out there, type them in or raise your hand in the chat box and we'll address those.
Joe, it's a very quiet group there today, but and that might be because I covered things at a very macro level. But one of the reasons I did that is I really think that the economic opportunities for trade are really shifting and changing. And I started by talking about how the Asia Pacific region is going to drive growth, and that I think the IMF is correct on. The World Bank says the same thing. It's part of it's just demographics, rising large population with rising consumer consumption and disposable income, governments that are investing in the infrastructure of their countries, and then of course you have to feed all those people. And so from a macro level, the demand is there. The real issue is as things shift and become more diverse, where for the last couple of decades the pie has been, let's sell to China, and China's still that market, but now the rest of the region needs to be evaluated. And I think any of the companies that are on there today, they might go away feeling more confused, because you need to, should I be selling into the developed economies of Japan or Taiwan? Should I be focused on India? Should I look at ASEAN? Do I have continued opportunities in China? And the answer is yes to all of those. So what I would encourage everybody to do that's on the call, if you want to discuss this more, reach out to Joe, talk to him. We can set up a call and we can talk about specific products or technologies that you have, or even services that you think would be a good fit, or you might have had some interest or some requests, and we can talk about those specifically and help you guys navigate with maybe which markets or opportunities to first look at.